Hello, welcome to Crying Out Cloud, the podcast that will make you laugh, cry, and reconsider all of your cloud security fears. I'm Eden from the CTO team at Wiz, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Amitai.
Hello.
From the threat research team. And today, our super special guest, Scott Piper.
Hi, everyone.
He is a cloud security expert extraordinaire. We're very excited he's here. And by day, he is a principal cloud security researcher at Wiz. And on top of that, to top it off, he is an organizer for Forward Cloudsec, which is super exciting because we get to talk about it today and hear firsthand about the conference last week. Are you guys ready? Are you guys excited?
Mm-hmm. Both.
Yep.
Wonderful. Scott, where are you right now?
I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Cool. Very far from us in Tel Aviv. But anyways, let's do this. Amitai, what are our 4 stories for today?
So today we're going to talk a bit about a zero-day vulnerability that's being exploited in the wild in an MFT application called MOVEit Transfer. Probably a lot of our audience has heard about this because it sort of made the news, like the mainstream media. We're also going to talk a bit about the new version of CVSS and how it can help to level up your own cloud security.
Very hip, very new.
We're also going to talk a bit about our takeaways from Forward Cloudsec 2023. We're going to take advantage of Scott being here to talk about what went on in the conference, what the conference is all about, what our favorite talks were, stuff like that.
And so you can have FOMO that you weren't there, like me.
And finally, we'll talk a bit about Barracuda.
Not the fish.
Not the fish. We can also talk about the fish if we have time. Only if we have time. The email security gateway appliance, which also had a zero-day vulnerability that was exploited in the wild by Chinese threat actors. And we're going to talk a bit about that.
Exciting. Mm-hmm. Good stuff. All right, let's start. Our first story, the MOVEit Transfer zero-day vulnerability, exploited in the wild, but that kind of goes without saying. Mm-hmm. There is a managed file transfer program that is used primarily in the US, largely by the government, and Clop, a ransomware group, discovered a vulnerability there and started testing it. And then a few weeks ago, they started using it heavily, or they went wild, you could say. It was a bad joke.
Very bad joke.
Thank you.
Anyways, I think we'll keep it in, though.
Thank you so much. Anyways, Progress saw someone exploiting this vulnerability. They saw some weird activity, and we don't know who, what, where, but patched it. And then the US government and others were looking into it, and they said it looks like Clop, who have in the past successfully exploited MFT vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. Where MFT means?
Managed File Transfer Program.
Which is like the modern version of like FTP, transferring files between large organizations, stuff like that.
For sure. Anyways, Clop was like, yep, it's us. And then if you want the gossip on who they attacked, they put it on their website. And yeah, this is a big deal. How long were they sitting on this for?
So a company called Kroll, they're a threat research team based on the forensics that they conducted. They estimate that they might have been sitting on this for over 2 years, which is a really, really long time to have a zero-day vulnerability, especially for like a non-nation state like Clop. Yeah, so they were apparently like testing it for a while, but I guess they were only really using it heavily over the past few months. And that's sort of when they did most of their operations. At least that's what it looks like.
Okay, interesting. And wait, so how do you guys transfer files? Do you guys use MOVEit? Is MOVEit like a popular platform?
I've never used it.
Scott, have you used it?
I had never heard of it, no. And I think what's also important from this is that a lot of the cloud providers do have alternatives to these types of file transfers. Like AWS has a managed FTP service that people can make use of. So there's some other options that people could use. And I tend to prefer to use the managed service offerings from the cloud providers where possible in order to leverage like their side of the shared responsibility model.
I transfer things like on WhatsApp. I don't know. That's my MFT.
The only problem with WhatsApp is it makes your picture resolution go down.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I don't send fancy pictures.
It's a trade-off.
I send memes.
Who's Klopp?
I send memes to Scott.
Scott, you guys don't use MOVEit apparently.
Would you rather I sent you memes with MOVEit so that it preserved the high quality of the images?
No, that's okay. We can stick to WhatsApp.
Thank you.
Amazing. Klopp. Who is Klopp? And how did they know to attribute this to Klopp before even Klopp took responsibility?
Yeah, so Clop is like a pretty famous ransomware group. Like that's their main thing. Like they target.
That's their shtick.
Yeah, exactly. Like what they used to do is just like target your network, encrypt everything, and then demand money. But like a lot of other cybercrime groups, they've sort of realized that extortion maybe pays better, maybe is easier to do. So that's what they've been doing recently. And they were behind a bunch of other MFT vulnerabilities that were being exploited over the past few years, like Go Anywhere and a few others. So when this first came out, like there were a lot of guesses in the industry, like, oh, maybe this is Clop. And then Microsoft, I think, were the first to say, like, we're pretty sure this is Clop. And then afterwards, like everybody else started attributing to them as well. And then, like you mentioned, they basically just published on their website, like, yep, this was up, guilty.
Hi.
Here's all the data we stole. Yeah, so it's pretty sure that it's them. I don't think they would take responsibility for something if it wasn't them. I hope not. I hope they're reliable as far as cybercrime groups go.
We'll take their word for it for now. MOVEit as a SaaS version and an on-prem version.
Yeah.
What's the breakdown of who uses what, and what are the associated consequences of each?
So, like Scott mentioned, like most cloud customers are going to prefer to use either the cloud native stuff, which is offered by the CSPs, and if they're going to use stuff like MOVEit in the cloud, they're probably going to prefer the SaaS version. So MOVEit has a few different versions. It has the SaaS offering where you basically, like, they store your data and you log in on their server, or you can host your own. So you basically install it like on a Windows server, you expose it to the internet, you give whatever other organizations you need to work with like credentials to access it and share files with the server. You give your employees access to it, and it basically sits in your environment. So our data shows that only around 1% of cloud environments have MOVEit installed. The number might be higher if we were to take into consideration like how many companies that have cloud environments are also using the SaaS version.
Interesting.
But this specific vulnerability apparently impacted everything. So like because it's the same software, so Clop apparently targeted the MOVEit like managed SaaS environment as well. And Progress, the company, the vendor behind MOVEit, they said that they actually saw, they didn't know it was Clop, but they saw a threat actor gain access to their environment, try to exploit it, try to run a few things, and they're still trying to figure out what data might have been taken. So this is pretty bad.
It's bad. Scott, for someone who like consulted and worked extensively in large cloud and security enterprises, what does the day after look like in a company that may have been using MOVEit? Like, how hard is this to respond to?
Most companies first try to figure out if they are using it anywhere. That alone is like a very hard question oftentimes. At large companies, like trying to do that asset inventory of trying to figure out what software they're using, where they might be using it. Like oftentimes they might be sending out like a mass email to their employees being like, hey, is anybody using this anywhere? Does anybody know about this? Like it can be awkward. And then, okay, so now you know that you're using it. you want to figure out, are you impacted in some way? Have you been compromised somehow? Chances are, if you didn't even know this software existed, you probably don't have any type of logging set up on it. And even if you do have logs, do those logs actually include information that lets you identify whether or not, it's been compromised? Are these logs stored in such a way that they are not going to be potentially, manipulated by an attacker in some way? Like, have you actually moved those logs off of the system that might be compromised and moved them to a different system? So yeah, it can be problematic to try and dig through all those different questions.
Right. Yeah, I guess if you have to call the IT guy who worked before you and be like, do you know what this is? Did we ever install this?
Yep.
He's like, wait, let me call the guy before me. Okay, so let's say you get to the point where you understand if you have it installed in your environment. What should you do? What is the best way to then go and protect yourself?
So at this point, it kind of seems like Clop did most of their activity like prior to this even going public. So probably a lot of the damage has probably already been done.
Sad.
Yeah. Like all the stuff they're publishing now is probably data that they collected a while ago, like in internet terms. It's definitely possible they're still trying, and it's definitely possible that if there are still organizations out there that haven't patched against this, then they might still be trying to, take whatever they can. But, moving it forward, that was a pun, by the way. Not much better than yours.
Mine wins.
Yeah. So one thing that you might want to do is make sure that this isn't directly exposed to the internet. So stuff like these applications should probably be behind a firewall limiting what IP addresses can access it in the first place, so it's not like publicly exposed to anyone who's scanning on the internet. It might be best to put it behind like a reverse proxy, or even put it behind...
Hide it. Hide and seek. Hide it well.
Yes. And like nowadays, you can pretty much put everything behind like an SSO landing page. And I checked, and MOVEit does support that. So if you want to make sure that you have...
MOVEit.
So move it behind
An
an
SSO landing page.
Yes, exactly. But again, that's for the next thing, right?
Yeah.
That won't help you this time.
See you guys next time. Okay, for our second story, we have the fourth version of CVSS and how it's leveling up cloud security. Like 2 weeks ago, they announced a new kid on the block, CVSS 4. So we can play a little game of who's your favorite CVSS.
We are definitely talking about this in a way that makes it sound much, much more hip than it actually is.
That's my job here, right?
Yeah.
To make CVSS cool. But CVSS is like a framework for describing the characteristics of a vulnerability and
Yeah.
calculating their severity.
Yeah, that's what most people, I think, know it as, right?
Yeah.
Like most people know CVSS as like critical and high vulnerabilities. It basically lets you prioritize vulnerabilities based on like a huge database that everybody shares. And CVSS is like the calculator, basically. That's what most people know it as.
Okay, so one of the things they included were attack requirements, which means...
Yeah, so they had a few changes from what I saw that I think might be useful for securing cloud environments. The attack requirements thing is a new field that basically says whether or not a vulnerability has any prerequisites for exploitation. So is this something that just anyone on the internet, no matter what, can exploit? Or does the system like have to be configured in a certain way? Does the attacker need to have some sort of prior information about the machine before they can exploit the vulnerability? So obviously stuff with no attack requirements, that makes the vulnerability more dangerous, right? Because it's basically a free-for-all. So in the cloud, one thing that you really want to work on, like in any other environment, is prioritization. So if you filter out vulnerabilities with high attack requirements, you can focus on the ones that are the free-for-all and the ones that are like the most dangerous at any given time. Like CVSS v3 had a few fields that allowed you to do that, but the attack requirements is sort of like a dedicated field for that. So I'm
So it's special.
Yeah, like as excited as I can be about CVSS, I am excited about this field.
It's a party. Subsequent system.
So CVSS v3 already had a few fields describing what the actual effect of a vulnerability on a system was. So you had the confidentiality impact, like does this expose things that aren't meant to be exposed? The integrity impact, like is an attacker capable of like changing things on the system that they're not supposed to be able to change? And the availability impact, which is for stuff like denial of service vulnerabilities, like does it make the system unavailable to users who use it regularly? And what they've added with CVSS v4 is something called subsequent system, which basically has all three of those fields, but for machines like in the local environment. So for cloud, that's really important because oftentimes you'll have attackers targeting
If you go to a bar, can you go bar hopping?
Exactly.
That's literally what this field is.
Lateral movement as bar hopping. That's a great analogy.
So glad we could summarize this. And lastly, a really cool thing that it adds is user interaction as an element of the score.
Yeah, so CVSS v3 already had a user interaction field, and it was defined as either none or required. So like basically describing whether or not a user has to do something in order for the vulnerability to be exploited or not. So for example, like vulnerabilities that involve phishing or vulnerabilities that require the user to click on something. And they've now changed it to be either passive or active, which is sort of feels like a more correct way to describe like the experience of a user being attacked. Like, do you just sit there and you're being exploited no matter what you do, or do you have to be like involved in the interaction with the attacker, right?
Yeah.
So that's not really that's more like a reframing of the exploitation experience.
It sounds like they hired someone at CVSS.
Yeah.
It's really good with words.
Yeah, MITRE's like, yeah, we're gonna try to make this cooler.
Yeah.
Make this more modern. Yeah.
We love it. Okay, Scott, are you ready? Dive into Forward cloudsec.
All right.
You're the like OG Forward cloudsecers, and you're a founder and incredibly influential in the conference. So, will you tell our listeners, first of all, who don't know, what is Forward cloudsec?
Yeah. So let me first correct that a little bit. That I had been the president for the first 2 years. We're now this was our 4th year. So I stepped down from a lot of my duties. So now I'm just like a board member. And so it's, but anyways, about Forward cloudsec itself, it is a nonprofit cloud security conference. And so this was born out of some folks, myself included, attending the very first Reinforce in 2019, which happened in Boston. And that conference is a great conference for what it is, but we felt that there were some things missing from it. And so specifically, that conference is geared more towards highlighting the capabilities and features of AWS. It's their own conference. They want to be able to talk about their stuff that they have going on. But we felt, there was not a discussion about the limitations of some of those services. And then another big thing is a lot of companies that are running on the cloud are running on multiple clouds. And so a conference put on by a single cloud service provider is not going to discuss the other cloud service providers. And some of the strategies and best practices that you might follow when you are on multiple clouds are going to be different. If you're all in on one cloud provider, you are perhaps more incentivized to make use of more of the capabilities of that single cloud provider. But if you are now running on multiple clouds, now you have the question of, do you choose some of the services on one of the providers versus the others in some way? Do you make use of third parties in order to better interconnect and integrate with all those cloud providers? So a whole bunch of different things, different reasons that we felt that there was maybe a need to have our own conference, and a conference that was focused on practitioners. So a conference basically by and for people that were actually securing their own companies in some way. And so although now I work at a vendor, most of the organizers are working for various companies, companies that work in healthcare, that work in financial industry. So we have a number of people on the organizing committee, and then also on the like paper review committee. So when people want to submit talks, and then, there's a committee that determines which talk should be selected. And so I think in total, I want to say it was like 18 people reviewing all the different talk submissions. So, all across different areas of expertise, different industries. So we try and make sure that there's not like any bias in when those talks are submitted. So also, like, for myself, whenever Wiz submits a talk, like, I recuse myself from reviewing that talk. So yeah, so I avoid reviewing it in order to ensure that I'm not adding bias in some way when we decide which talks to be selected. And so everybody on the review committee is asked to do something similar. Like, don't review talks from your own company or from perhaps any company that you feel you might have a bias for. So if you have, what's that?
Or against.
Yeah, exactly. Like if there's a competitor, like, for the company you work at, that's also a situation in which we don't want you to be reviewing that, so that you're not like downvoting them or something.
Very cool. If you want to hear more about Forward CloudSec, wait for the Crying Out Cloud special episode. All right, for our last story, we have the Barracuda ESG.
Email Security Gateway.
Correct. That is what that stands for. In late May, i.e. a few weeks ago, Barracuda announced that there was a 0-day RCE vulnerability that had been exploited in the wild.
Yep.
And the vulnerability was in how the gateway was handling email attachments. So you said, Amitai, that this was attributed to a Chinese threat actor, right?
Yeah, so Mandiant, who's been looking into this, they have attributed this to a Chinese threat actor. They haven't clustered this to any known Chinese threat actor, like any priory researched threat actor out there, but they have reason to believe that the actor behind this is the Chinese government. It's based on a bunch of different stuff that they found. On the one hand, you have sort of the more classic attribution stuff like reuse of certain IP addresses, reuse of certain tooling, which is how often you attribute stuff to other actors. But in this case, they also saw a few things that made them believe that what they were after, the information they were after, was aligned with the interests of the Chinese government.
So the targets of this were both public and private sector organizations across a bunch of countries, but many of which were government agencies. Yeah. And what happened was they would send emails with malicious attachments that granted them initial access. But what's really clever was that they would send it mainly to their spam, so people didn't even notice that this email was coming in.
Yeah, they basically purposely used typos and weird keywords and tried to make it look as spammy as possible. Just that's what it seemed like, just to make it get caught by the spam filters, to make as little humans as possible actually know that these emails had arrived in their inboxes.
Except for those people who check their spam folders.
As a hobby.
As a hobby. Let me just clean this one up. Okay, so they deployed the malware, which pretended to be ESG modules. And then they also were very clever because they didn't just collect emails, they would move laterally. Yeah,
so they used their access to the ESG in the network to basically gain access to other parts of the network because they had the ability to run code.
Yes. And I was telling Amitai that it's kind of like back in like 2008 when you would send an email. You'd be like, email your 10 friends for good luck and prosperity. That's what they did.
Yeah, so they basically, they used their access to each ESG to send emails to other targets they were interested in because that made it appear more legitimate that there was traffic from like one government agency to another government agency.
Yes, makes a lot of sense. And then after Barracuda published their initial findings about this, then they changed tactics.
Yeah, so that's like a sign of a very sophisticated, determined, and persistent actor. That basically, once they get the feeling that they're caught, whether it's based on public information or non-public information, then it's sort of like a fight or flight response. Like some
Kind of like when your kid gets in trouble and they were like, "It wasn't me," but then they did it again, but in a different way.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
That's what I did as a kid.
That's not the analogy I was going for.
No, okay.
Your bar hopping analogy was better, I think. Yeah.
We can stick to that one. Okay.
Anyway, so actors are often like, if they care, then they'll usually have like a flight or fight response. Like they'll either run away immediately, cover all their tracks, delete everything, make sure nobody can ever find them ever, or they'll just
Double down.
Yeah, and like make sure that nobody can catch them, and change everything, and make sure that their persistence mechanism is even more persistent than usual, which it seems that this is what that actor did.
Does Barracuda exist in cloud environments?
Yeah, so it seems that it does. Barracuda ESG is deployed as what's known as an appliance, which is either like a physical box that you
Or
you
an
put
espresso machine.
or an espresso machine, or a vacuum cleaner, or a toaster, or it's a virtual machine that's in your environment that's basically controlled by the vendor. So in cloud environments, we also have appliances, and appliances are sort of like black holes in a way, in the sense that you don't really know what goes in and out of them. You don't really know what's going on them. They're usually encrypted, so you can't really see what's going on the disk.
You're out of the loop.
Yeah, but the good side of it is that the vendor, when they can take advantage of that they're basically in full control of what's going on in the machine, to deploy patches automatically, to run scripts, to collect information from it for forensics, for example, and that it seems that's what Barracuda's been doing. Like they've been making sure that
they've been on it.
Yeah, like they've been making sure that if you have this in your environment and it's connected to the internet, or they have access to it as they should to make it work, then they'll make sure you're patched. And they've said that they've notified everyone that they've discovered was impacted by this, and they've sort of sent them like pop-ups.
So if you use Barracuda, you would know. Like they will have reached out to you, and you guys are in the loop.
Yeah, according to them, they reached out to everybody who was impacted by this. It's just that there is a certain sense of like not knowing for sure. Like you're not able to look at the disk and like run an antivirus scan to make sure that nothing's on it.
So you have to just take their word for it and go with that.
But their word is good, so that's okay.
That's good. Amitai and I were talking about this earlier, and he was explaining a little bit more about the understanding that it was a Chinese actor.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give this context in detail to the listeners?
Sure thing. So one of the really interesting parts of the report that Mandiant put out is that one of the ways they determined this was probably a Chinese actor is that the threat actor didn't just like randomly collect like every single email that was flowing through the ESG. They had like keyword filters in place to only collect certain emails, and those keywords were often like the names of like academics in Taiwan, for example, or all sorts of like diplomats that are in contact with China.
It's almost like the Chinese have a very clear definition of who they like and don't like.
Yeah, as does every country, to be honest. Yeah,
it's true.
But like that's one way that they determined that China was probably standing behind this. It is possible that this is like a really, really, really sophisticated false flag operation, and like whoever's behind it was like, I'm going to make it look like China by putting a bunch of keyword filters for stuff that Chinese state-sponsored actors are interested in. But that's less likely. Like it's probably the simplest explanation here is probably best.
All right, it's time for the podaways. That is our newly coined term for podcast takeaways. For the first story, the MOVEit Transfer 0-day vulnerabilities exploited in the wild. What are the takeaways?
It sounds so romantic.
It is.
So you should definitely patch the latest version if you haven't done so. Progress, the vendor, has recommended that their customers disable HTTP on servers hosting MOVEit Transfer until this sort of blows over. MOVEit also has an FTP mode, and that's safer to use at the moment because the vulnerability doesn't apply there. In general, probably best to continue to stay informed because this is probably not the last we're going to hear about this. As I mentioned, like Klopp have only published the names of some of the organizations they targeted. They haven't started releasing data yet, at least not at the moment we're recording this. So this is probably going to continue to be a thing. Like it's hit mainstream media. Probably going to be talking about this next time as well.
Cool. The new CVSS v4. What are the takeaways?
So I think be sure to check it out. I think
you're in the loop now, so when it drops.
Yeah, Scott and I are gonna do like a book club, where every meeting we open the page of the new framework.
Can I be invited to the book club?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'll bring cookies. Okay, our third story was on Ford cloudsec 2023. What are the takeaways? Scott, this one's on you.
To watch the recordings if you weren't there live. There were 2 tracks, so even if you were there in person, you would have missed half of the talks because they were in the other room. So watch the talks once they go live. And hopefully submit to speak next year and try and get a ticket if you're able to attend.
Good luck.
And tell all your friends.
Yeah.
Or don't, because then the chance you'll get a ticket will go down.
True. And for our last story, Barracuda.
Not the fish.
Not the fish. The ESG 0-day vulnerability. What are the takeaways?
So practically, not much because you're probably already patched if you use this in your environment. But generally an interesting story and something to watch out for. There might be other actors doing similar things. But we'll keep an eye out. We'll keep a fish eye out.
Ooh, nice. It's a cool lens. Anyways, that is all that we have for this episode of Crying Out Cloud, presented by the cloud security company Wiz. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and remember,
unlike your IAM policies, more stars is better.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us. This was really fun.
This was amazing.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully next time you'll come to Tel Aviv and do it with us in the flesh.
Or we'll go to Salt Lake City.
Actually, I want to go to Salt Lake City. I take that back.
Yeah, come out here. Ski season. It's wonderful. Right now it's getting to fire season where there's just fires everywhere and smoke everywhere. But
that sounds exciting.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to living out here.
We'll be there when the mountains open for ski.
Okay.
Cool.